Welcome to the Tribune's Shelf Life. I'm Mandira Nayar, an independent journalist. I get paid to read, and I'm very excited to welcome Amitav Ghosh today to the show, a writer who needs no introduction. His new book, Ghost Eye, is an incredibly sweeping story which is set across two continents and different timelines. It is a book that is set between Calcutta, a place where Amitav grew up, and Brooklyn, a place where he lives. And in both places, he conjures up these spaces incredibly vividly, evocatively, lovingly, really. It's a book that captures a lot. It has a love story, possibly one of the most romantic books that he's written, a love that transcends different births. It is it has a superhero element. Ghost Eye is sort of saving the environment. It's set at a point of time when we're hurtling towards this abyss, as he talks about, in terms of a climate crisis. And it is, as usual, luminously written. So welcome to the show, Amitav. I would really like to start off with asking you, in the book, the main character, it's set about, in many ways, about the main character looks at reincarnation. There is this university that they go to study rebirth, and I wanted to understand if this story sort of comes from belief. What do you think about reincarnation, and is this a question of belief?
Not at all. And I'm actually sort of wary of using the term reincarnation, which is why throughout the book, cases of the reincarnation type is apostrophized. I found, my problem with the term is simply that reincarnation implies a certain kind of metaphysic, a sort of mechanism whereby, one soul passes from one to another, or something like that. And I don't subscribe to any such metaphysic. I'm completely agnostic about what the mechanism might be. What I do know, though, is that there are innumerable cases of children born with past life memories. I mean, this is not a question of belief; it's just a fact. I mean, there's it's a mountain of material on this subject. So many cases have been documented. And, they don't even need to be documented in a sense, because any of us growing up in India, we know of children of this kind. We know of friends, relatives, who have once had these past life memories or something like that. So really, the whole question of belief is not germane. I mean, belief you have to have if you actually subscribe to a theory of reincarnation.
In this book, you go back to many spaces, and in many ways, it feels like a book that if you've read all your books, it feels like a familiar landscape. So there is a story about there is a character from the Hungry Tide. There is the Glass Palace. You go back to the Sundarbans. There is this sort of feeling of familiarity. And you go back to a point of time, and you go back to many stories of Burma. You talk about Japanese soldiers who are reincarnated as Burmese boys later. They tie us around a different way. You talk about Nats, these spiritual, these spirits that can be mischievous and menacing at the same time. So can you really talk about how Burma inspires you, this sort of Burma space that you sort of go back to write about? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Now, as you know, I've written about Burma, not just in the Glass Palace, but in many, I've touched upon it elsewhere as well. Burma is, on the one hand, now it's a very sad, tragic place. But if you actually visit Burma, it's completely beguiling. I mean, people are so warm and wonderful. And just the sights and the landscapes are so incredibly varied. And, the landscape of Burma is very alive. I mean, you can feel the presence of various kinds of non-human others, who were there throughout. Particularly interesting is Mount Popa, which is actually considered the home of the 37 nuts. And it's also where the Indian National Army fought its last battle,
Yeah.
So in so many ways, it's a place that's very meaningful, so to speak. So yes, uh, you know, Burma has a very special place in my memories, in my mind, just as the Sundarban does. So I
Yeah.
sort of keep returning to these landscapes.
The book is also a love letter to food. Varsha, the young girl who has a rebirth, is 3 years old, and it's a great hook. You start this book where she is born in this incredibly orthodox Jain family, vegetarian, and she, at 3 years old, demands fish. And then the book really goes into the different kinds of fish. It goes into, cooking. It goes into the memory she has about how she eats this fish. And, you're somebody who does a lot of research. I know that when you started writing, the Sea of Puppies, you learned how to sail. So, can you really talk about this idea of food and how that shapes the book? How much of it is personal? You write about these, about fish markets that you describe with great detail. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, look, food is the primary medium through which we as human beings relate to our environment. I mean, we are animals. All animals relate
Yeah. Yeah.
to their environment through food. And it's a very striking thing to me that actually, there are innumerable cases of, past life memories where this happens. I mean, the child begins to demand a different kind of food. And in India, especially because of the complexities of our caste system and so on, often this demand for food arises in relation to something that's forbidden within their own home. Uh, you
Yeah.
know, so there are innumerable cases of a child suddenly who's born, a child in a Brahmin family, for example, in UP or something, demanding to eat meat. And and it's actually very striking that many often these children are so insistent that their family gives in and says, go to some other family and eat meat there and
Yeah.
come back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the child actually does that. And of course, after a while, these memories begin to fade, usually around 5, 6 years of age. And then the child, grows into its own body, so to speak, and stops craving those other foods. But there are many, many cases like this. And you mentioned the Japanese in Burma. So in Burma, these are the oddest cases. I mean, these children suddenly want to eat raw fish,
I know.
or they want to eat, yeah, they want to, they refuse to eat spicy Burmese food and they want like bland Japanese food. So this was very striking to me. I mean, the things that are most striking in these past life memory cases is that these memories relate most immediately to food and then to language. So
Yeah.
often what happens is that children will start speaking some other language.
When Dino is wooing Varsha, it's a really important part of the book. He goes back to recreate these recipes for her, sort of trying to evoke the memory of what she had had, fish that she had had in her previous life, which she remembers vividly. You talk about him stomping mustard, the smell, the pungent smell, and he has a central question, which is also he raises a central question, which about can you eat the food that your grandmothers had? And in many ways, that's a central question of our lives. For many people in Punjab who came across food during partition, food becomes a memory, and they dream of having a mango which is sweeter somehow with nostalgia. So, can you really talk about how much of it is nostalgia shape, but also the fact that we really cannot eat any of this because of as you write about GMOs, how GMOs sort of come in and change the way of food and flavor and timing. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
It's very interesting that you mention that because actually, there's a whole movement now around the world, but especially here in India, to reclaim, as it were, heritage products of various kinds. And I must say, I was fairly skeptical. I was a little bit skeptical about, whether it's even really possible to recreate those tastes. But a couple of nights ago, I went to a restaurant here in Kolkata, a new one, where this couple have really been placing enormous emphasis on sort of serving heritage forms of rice and ghee and so on. And there they served one thing, several things. I mean, absolutely amazing food, really. I mean, just reminded me, of the incredible deliciousness of our cuisine here. But they served one thing which just completely became, for me, like, Proust's Madeleine. And it was the simplest thing. It was like a mash of seam, seam, the
Oh,
beans.
yeah, beans,
Uh,
yeah.
the- yeah, so it was a mash of that. And really, suddenly, I was thinking of my grandmother. This was something she used to make and which I haven't tasted in decades. And
Yeah.
it was completely transporting. So, yes, it does happen. I mean, now, really, people who run restaurants and so on, and chefs who are very conscious of these things. There are many such in Bengal, and here in Bengal, we also have an amazing seed collector called Debal Deb, who
Mm,
saved really 1,000 varieties of rice.
mm.
And some of these varieties of rice can grow under 6 feet of water. So they're flood resistant. Some of them only need one watering at the time
Wow.
of planting. You never have to water them again, and that's drought resistant rice. So the environment has given us these resources, and because of GMO and all this so-called progress, we just ignored them. We wasted these resources.
Yeah.
Fortunately, now people are trying to reclaim them.
The book, there are no, that it's always also about belief in that in many ways answers to questions that do not have neat scientific explanations. And I wanted you to talk about a time when you write about writing, for example, um, in about a fire during Gun Island, where you write about a fire in LA and it happens 6 months later, and in Calcutta Chromosome, a book that you wrote many years earlier, you write about incident that happens in a particular address, Robinson Street, I think, in Calcutta, and later macabre incident happens, and in many years later, it's where the House of Horrors of Calcutta, as newspapers call it, happened. This man was discovered with living with two skeletons. Can you really talk about this space that writers inhabit, a sort of time travel, a different world, and how in many ways it sort of you're sort of, while you're writing, you also you can predict in many ways what is going to happen. Can you talk a little bit about that space that writers inhabit?
Yeah, I think that's something we don't talk about enough, really, as writers. That writing, there is something very strange. It's not a life that normal people would choose. I mean, there have been times when I found myself wondering why didn't I become a chartered accountant? Life would have been so much easier, I think. I don't
Yes,
know.
that's true.
But yeah, there is something very weird about writing. And for me, it's something that I for a long time I wouldn't accept. But it is the case that very weird things happen. I mean, these strange sorts of time loops and things that you find yourself in. Uh, Something truly inexplicable. I mean, how did I set that scene at this very particular address, which I had never visited or been to or
Yeah.
anything, number 3 Robinson Street in Calcutta. And then years later, this weird thing, this completely macabre thing happens there. And that's just one instance, but I've had many very uncanny encounters like that, including one in Kasauli when I was writing the shadow lines. So,
So what happens in Kasauli?
it'll take a long time to tell, but and it wasn't me alone. There were like three of us over there. We were in this very old house, actually, the three of us. And it was the house where Amrita Shergill's sister lived and died, and she was a piano player. And she was Vivan Sundaram's mother, in fact,
That yes, that house still exists, right? And this is the same incident. This is sort of the same thing that happens in the book. When the Murphy radio goes off and they can't find a way of understanding why it keeps going off.
Yes, very much so, yes.
Yeah.
Vivan was, you know, at that point trying to sort of run it like a residency because it was a huge, rambling house, very beautiful. And one night we very clearly heard the piano playing in what was his mother's room.
This is a debate between science and and what is not easily explainable. You talk about Jung and this idea of coincidence and how he looks at this idea of synchronicity, and how do you, I mean, in a way, do you think that this is what we are? This sort of, we have to sort of navigate this world between belief or what is, what of science and what is belief, between this what is explainable by science and what is science. Do you think this thing? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think we all live with this because I think it's very important to be skeptical. If some farmer suddenly comes to me and says, "Oh, my tree is talking to me," of course I'll laugh at him and say, "Don't be an idiot." Or if someone comes and says, "Oh, I mean, we all know those people who will tell you, 'Oh, my cat said this to me yesterday.'" Of course, you have to be skeptical about those things. But that doesn't mean that very inexplicable things don't happen. And I think that's really the point. That is, our skepticism is very essential in that it allows us to truly gauge the extent of the strangeness of certain kinds of events. And that's what interests me, really, that after one has exhausted all one's skeptical instincts, one shouldn't get trapped into the position of thinking that nothing extraordinary ever happens. Because as a writer, I know that extraordinary things happen. Otherwise, the whole business of writing would.
The book, you recreate Calcutta in 1969 and in the 1970s, and you have this. You write about this point when you write about Calcutta very tenderly, and you say that period where there were many you talk about power cuts and things like that, and you said that sort of Calcutta, it's not only a change in spelling, it's also a different world, and how that world, living in the 70s, in many ways prepared you for the real world. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that really means and how that's shaped your life?
What I was trying to say there is that really, growing up in Calcutta as I did, in those days, but you could also say this of many other parts of India at the time. We could take nothing for granted. I mean, you literally couldn't take anything for granted. You really can't. I mean, if you decided, for example, that, okay, now I'm going to sit down and do this or that, and then suddenly the lights go off and there's nothing you can do. And so because we had to go through that, we learned, to work around these limitations and surprises. In a way, I think the new generation, they're just not accustomed to this, and they won't be able to cope. And this stuff is coming again. There's no doubt about that. I mean, these systems are going to break down.
You write about this time, during COVID, where where Shoma is brought back from the dead. She's given an injection and she sees her body from up and she sort of comes back. And you wrote about how this was something that your mother experienced, you watched when she sort of came back. You talk really about this idea, this uncanniness, really, and this idea of life after death, of this near death experience, actually. Sorry, not life after death, but this near death experience and what that does to your body.
Well, the near-death experience is another phenomenon that's widely attested, and many doctors, etc., have witnessed these things, where a life seems to leave a body, and but then they come back sometimes, and then they report, what happened in that interim. And yeah, it was a very, it wasn't actually during COVID, but in January of that year, 2020, when my mother was very sick, in a nursing home with COPD, which is what she had for much of her life. And, there were like 5 minutes, not a very long time, but where she was really talking about what she was seeing on the other side. And it was, it was a very strange and discombobulating experience to actually hear her say these things, to describe what she was seeing. And at the time, I really didn't have a good idea of what was happening. But later, when I started reading more about near-death experiences, I realized that's what she was going through.
In Nutmeg's Curse and in Gun Island, you talk about the idea of folklore. In many ways, how we have these stories that we tell about ourselves, and how these stories actually are connect us to the world that we were, to nature, and how colonialism sort of takes us away from it. It sort of, there's an erasure of this of the stories, and we sort of look at them with skepticism because they cannot be explained, but also how that erasure of this connection is what has sort of brought us to this crisis. And can you really, in some ways, talk about how, stories like that, like Panchatantra, how that informs us of the world that we inherit? And is that a way that we could hang on to hope?
Well, I certainly think that it's the case that it's when uh, something that happened from about the 17th century onwards, with the so-called European Enlightenment, when really people began to think of the earth as something that existed primarily to be exploited, to be extracted from, where the things of the earth were just thought to be there for human use. And I think we don't adequately allow for the fact that this ideology really was a very elite ideology, and it was also a very masculinist ideology. So it was a small group of European men thinking that the world existed for them to exploit. Now this idea has been universally accepted by elites everywhere, as much in India, Indonesia, Kenya, wherever. And it's been just completely embraced by these elite groups. And we see with what result. I mean, the deforestation, the mining, the extraction. It's just we can see how the implementation of of this kind of ideology is really creating an absolute dystopia all around us. So I do think, obviously, just changing an idea is not going to make that much difference in the real world. But I do also think that unless our understanding of the world that we live in, unless there's a change in that, that is going to be very hard for us to ever turn back from this trajectory, which is just now it's so perfectly clear. It's just hurtling towards the abyss.
So do you think there is any hope?
I don't think that the present circumstance, the present sort of systems that we live with, I really don't think that they're sustainable, and I think they will uh, collapse. And in fact, we are seeing the collapses happening in the geopolitical structures, but also in the systemic structures. I mean, you just take that enormous breakdown in electricity distribution that happened in Texas, a couple of years ago. I mean, they went without power for, I think it was like 15 hours during a terrible snowstorm and a blizzard and so on. And many people died. There was immense suffering, and it's precisely because people are not, uh, in any sense, mentally and psychologically prepared for these collapse scenarios. That things very, very rapidly get worse and worse. I mean, for example, just last night I came across, I met a very well-known writer who lives actually in Oxford in England, and he had to come back to India to have some medical procedure done because their medical systems are virtually nearing collapse.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these very highly articulated, highly developed systems, at one level, when they're working well, they deliver very good services. But the more complex they are, the more so-called developed they are, the more fragile they are, the more likely to collapse because they don't have, a sort of what Nicholas Taleb calls anti-fragility built in. So, yeah, I mean, I think we are seeing many kinds of collapse just ongoing right now. I mean, look at Germany deindustrializing, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's such a
Yeah.
bizarre thing to see. I mean, have you seen how the German railways have essentially collapsed? I mean, Germany was all about,
Yeah.
the
Precision. Yeah.
train running out.
Yeah. 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 Well,
Now,
I met it.
yeah,
It's
hardly any
yes.
trains run on.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for being part of Shelf Life. It is an incredible book. Thank you for being part of us, and thank you for being part of the show, and thank you for spending so much time with us, and thank you for your wonderful answers. Thank you.